This is TWiT.
There's some really interesting Microsoft news.
Yeah, there is.
In a lot of different ways. But I think the one that stunned me this week was the announcement that Microsoft and Sony are going to work together.
Right.
Hereditary enemies.
This also apparently stunned the PlayStation team, who had never heard this was happening.
Yep.
So this was the president of Sony saying we're going to use Azure for PlayStation networking?
Well,
Azure, PlayStation gaming service.
Maybe.
Whatever it may be. Yeah.
Right? It was so vaguely worded, this whole thing. And that might just be legal mumbo-jumbo, right? But
honestly, it wasn't as bad. My first pass, I was like, okay, wait a minute. What did they announce exactly? And then I kind of went through it again. I was like, well, actually, it's not too bad. I think the problem is at this point, at this juncture, they don't really have a thing they can announce, like PlayStation, blah, 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 whatever, running on Azure. But I'd be shocked if this didn't pan out the way they described it.
When I read it, I thought it either means Sony is going to use xCloud as their game streaming service, or it means Sony is building its own game streaming service that's going to use Azure as the hosting platform.
It's definitely
it is, right?
Yeah. And so this goes to the heart of what. Sorry.
No xCloud.
What is xCloud?
Well, no. So xCloud is Microsoft's service, right?
Right.
It's not their game. It's not their game. It's a game service for Xbox.
But it's basically the streaming version of Xbox Game Pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's not out yet, but they've announced it.
Yeah.
And
right.
Why would Sony? I mean, it's the competitor to Sony's own streaming service.
But in the course of developing Azure, one of the many things they did was knowing that they'd be working on this game stuff, is they created workloads that are specific for video gaming, and those things can be used by any third party. So the interesting thing about this is I never suspected that Sony would turn to Microsoft for some reason. I always thought of it like, you're a publisher like Activision or a smaller game maker, whoever you may be. Obviously, you could turn to Microsoft and use their back-end services for your own service. I thought the big play for them was going to be Nintendo, because Nintendo has almost no
they need it
scalable online service type stuff, and so it would make
sense.
But
there are rumors about Nintendo and Microsoft, right?
Oh yeah, and that makes sense to me. I will say, just to put a little asterisk on this story, there is no way that Sony would only use Microsoft for their coming game service, right? In the sense that any hyper-scalable cloud service of the future will want to have at least two providers in case one goes down, or because certain things work better in certain areas, whatever it might be. You can expect Sony to sign up with AWS in the future or somebody else. I think that's the one thing we have to kind of keep in perspective here. They're almost certainly not only going to use Microsoft's infrastructure.
What does PlayStation Network use right now? Do we know?
That's what I wondered too. Do they use their own cloud?
I can't imagine that they do. But, the way to think about this is Sony today has a game streaming service called PlayStation Now. And they have some number of games. Actually, they have hundreds of games. They have a lot more games in that service than Microsoft has in Xbox Game Pass. But the percentage of PlayStation users today who are actually streaming games over that service compared to PlayStation gamers who are downloading games and playing them on the machine directly or putting a disc in the drive and playing it that way has got to be tiny, 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 right? But when you look at the future of gaming, as Microsoft, Sony, Google, also Amazon really, and probably others envision it, to actually stream games to some majority of gamers, which I think is where this is heading, you need an infrastructure size that's much, much bigger than anything Sony has. And I think what they realize is they have to partner with some others, and it will be others, not other, to make that happen. It's not something they have to worry about for 2019 or 2020 or whatever. It's there'll be future Sony consoles. The mix will come and go. It will work a lot like it did with digital music. In the beginning when iTunes came out, Steve Jobs said nobody wants to rent music or whatever. Well, you know what? Today they do, and I think that's how gaming is going to go as well.
Yeah, I think
I
completely agree.
Amazon's building its own game streaming service, everybody believes, right? And Google has one or is building one, and Microsoft has one. So it's not like they're picking Azure because they're the only one that's not a competitor or is a competitor. Like it's like everybody's going to have a service.
Yeah. Well, okay. So there are two sides to this, right? So Google has a service called Stadia or whatever, right? Stadia, I think is the name of it. That's Google's service, right? There's no concept yet of some other company licensing Stadia, right? Although maybe that happens, I don't know. But right now, that's just the Google service. Right. Google also has back-end infrastructure that they sell to other companies, just like Amazon does, just like Microsoft does. They just happen to be a little smaller, but they do have it. Yeah. And they talk about the reach of all that and everything. So Activision or Nintendo or Sony or whoever could use them, maybe use them with other companies, whatever. It doesn't mean they're using Stadia. I think we got to be careful about what we're comparing here. I mean, they're using Google's back-end infrastructure. And that's what Sony is doing with Azure, or looking at doing, I guess. I always thought that one of the big advantages that Microsoft had was that they could kind of win by losing in this coming generation of streaming, because if they're getting the money on the back end from other services, who cares if xCloud is number 2 or number 3 in the market? They could still end up making more money, more profits, more revenues, whatever, if enough other companies license their Azure technologies, right? Well, now you've got the number 1 player in video games announcing a deal, which is why this is such a big deal. What if Sony won, whatever that means, the cloud streaming market, just like they've won the console generation today, but they had to use Azure to do it, right? I mean, this is like Microsoft winning by losing. It's kind of interesting.
So let me throw out another question, and I'm just showing my gaming ignorance.
Okay.
Oops. Wait a minute.
If you paid attention during the Xbox segment every week, Mary Jo.
Sound.
She's disappeared from the ether. She unplugged her. So, I hear you.
I lost my sound for a second.
Yeah, we hear you. I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when Microsoft has said xCloud's going to be a cross-platform gaming service, do you think they could mean as much as, and it would work on Sony consoles?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Assuming that Sony allowed that. Yeah.
Right. So that's what made me think this announcement might have 2 parts, like the xCloud part and then just the pure Azure part, right? But the way that announcement was worded was so vague. Well, it was like they're exploring opportunities. Right?
Yeah, they specifically called it Azure, right? Which to me says it's not. They never said anything about xCloud. No. That's a different discussion in a way. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but it absolutely could happen, right? So Microsoft has some standalone service called xCloud. We know it's going to work on mobile. We know it's going to work on Windows. We know it's going to work on Xbox. Probably at some time it's going to make sense for this thing to work on smart TVs, to work on Rokus and Apple TVs, Sony PlayStation 5 or whatever they call the next console. Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, today you don't see Xbox on Sony. You don't see Sony games on Xbox, et cetera, et cetera. But, this is the new open Microsoft. And Sony, I mean, I don't know if people understand how big of a deal this is, aside from the obvious. Sony is the company that blocked crossplay, right? On I don't know, on Minecraft and on other games in recent years. I mean, this is kind of an interesting thing. I suppose I could imagine Sony saying, look, we don't want xCloud on PlayStation, but we still want to use Azure for the back end. And that would be acceptable to Microsoft. That's still a net win for Microsoft.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. I guess we're just kind of reading the tea leaves because they've said.
We are. We're just trying to read into what the thing said, because it was pretty vague. When I saw this last week, I immediately said to Paul, I wonder if this was supposed to be a build announcement.
Oh, by the way, as soon as you said that, I completely agree. And the reason is, remember they talked about the 4 clouds, right? And gaming was one of them, and they had nothing to show for it. And that was really weird, because when I read that, I thought, wow, they really think xCloud's going to be a bigger deal than I would have imagined. And that's not what that means, right? I mean, it doesn't mean they don't think xCloud won't be big, but when you put Sony into the equation, that becomes part of their gaming cloud in a way, right? They're servicing these giant gaming engines from other companies.
So is this just a partner announcement, really?
It's a customer win announcement, right? That's how I looked at it
really
in a way.
It's don't
but
read too
you
much
cannot don't
strategically
underplay
into
it. But it's Sony, right? I mean, in other words,
I know. No, it's big.
If Bethesda Software said, "Hey, we're going to have an online service and it's going to run on Azure and like the next version of Doom. If you want to play it online, that's one of the ways you can do it." And yeah, that would be cool. That's cool.
But it fits.
Actually, Bethesda was on the Sony thing, but I mean
the Microsoft agnostic kind of.
Yes, it does.
They want. Nadella's trying to position them as above the power. The competition, OS competition, and all that. We serve everyone equally.
It also slots into the direction for the company where we keep talking about how the future is Azure. We always say this. You look at the financials today, and it's like it's not all Azure, obviously, but they're kind of heading in that direction. And this neatly puts gaming in that direction and very fully, and in a much bigger way than just the future of Xbox Live is on Azure. It's great. I mean, there's only some tens of millions of people who are doing that. There's only some single-digit millions that are doing Xbox Game Pass today. We're not talking about a giant scalable thing like you would see with Azure more broadly. It's just not hundreds of millions or billion users. It's not. But if you can get Sony on there, if you can get other third parties on there, gaming is humongous. Gaming is bigger than Hollywood movies, right? It's like it's one of the biggest entertainment markets in the world. Microsoft's not going to have all of it. That's
is this analogous to. Nobody ever wanted to admit it. I'm sure Microsoft would love to announce it, but Apple's iCloud ran on Azure.
It did, in part.
We knew that.
I was going to say, but not fully, right? And that's the point. In other words, you never want to rely on one provider for something.
Well, most people are multi-cloud these days, right?
Yes.
This is a very common.
Yep.
I know this because when I was at the Thousand Eyes event, it was a sponsor of ours, but they talked a lot about this. That what people are often trying to figure out is how I can do multi-home cloud that way. So I'm not relying on anyone.
It's just like look, this is big for us. We cover Microsoft for a living, so this is a big deal. But, this is a lot like that PWA conversation. You download an app for the store and you never think like, oh, I wonder if this was written in C++, or I wonder if this was a web app. Like
you shouldn't
normal
have to
people
care.
don't. Yeah.
You shouldn't have
if you're some gamer and you're in Connecticut or Utah or Africa or wherever you are and you're playing your game and, something in the back, some data center goes off site or offline or whatever, and wherever it is, you don't have to think about that stuff. You don't care if you're running on AWS or Azure or whatever. You're just playing the game, and that's what this is. They're providing electricity.
And it's not really a capitulation by Sony, or is it? And now they're not saying, well, what we were doing didn't work, so we're going to go to Microsoft.
No, they don't have. How could they possibly?
We don't know what they were
deploy infrastructure.
We don't know
like
what they were doing, right?
Yeah,
it makes perfect sense, really.
Yeah, we know they're not always. Well, I've never seen them listed in the top 10 cloud vendors list of any kind.
Yeah,
right. I mean, they may have their own data centers that have been running their gaming cloud service, right? But
you know what this is a little bit like is the new Edge, right? Microsoft would describe it as, look, we took all the great stuff from Chrome, stripped out all the Google garbage, and we're going to build the best browser. We think we're going to have the best browser. If you look at what Sony said about this agreement, they said we're going to use Microsoft's cloud, and we're going to build the best entertainment service in the world on top of it. So they're going to do their own thing.
It would be foolish to assume that they're going to use xCloud or support xCloud or anything.
I don't think that's even a thing.
That's a separate deal.
I could be completely wrong.
It could be a separate deal.
Yeah. I mean, it could happen or it could not happen, but it's not tied to this.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, it doesn't say anything about xCloud.
Right.
It's just another partner win. It's just another
it is, but a huge one. And there was another part of it that we didn't touch on, which is they also announced an alliance so that Microsoft Azure AI technologies are going to somehow work with Sony image sensors in consumer products. But they don't say, which products, how that's going to work.
Well, it would be Windows Hello, right?
Well, it could be a future VR type thing. It could be. It could be anything.
Okay.
Look, they make phones, which
TVs,
a lot of people think.
Right?
Yep. I mean, it could be all kinds of things.
Well, Sony's sensors are in most phones, including the iPhone. I mean, they're the number one camera sensor out there.
So maybe this is going to be. Actually, you said Windows Hello. I think that's pretty smart. Somebody walks into a room, the TV or the console or the service, whatever, recognizes them. They get their customized content.
It's not like Microsoft makes a phone. So it wouldn't be that kind
too
of
soon, Leo.
relationship.
Too soon.
Painful subject. And this is not like Google saying, "Oh yeah, we're giving up on the cloud. We're going to use Azure." This is a company that doesn't really have a cloud presence of any kind. We don't know.
That's the point. Yeah,
It might be like Facebook. It might be like Facebook saying we're going to use Azure. That would be a big victory. I mean, Facebook runs their own network, as far as I know. They don't use anybody else's cloud. But
look, Sony is going to always be competitive in video gaming. They probably. I mean, look, if there's no reason to believe they're not
Windows laptops too. I mean, they're
They're
partners in other.
Actually, no, they don't.
They used to.
Sold
they don't.
Yeah.
They sold
really?
Bio, remember?
Yeah.
But they
right.
used to. So I mean, it's not like they're enemies in every way. They're friends.
I don't even think they're enemies per se. I mean, obviously they compete, but
right. That's right.
I don't.
That's a kind of that's a naive way to look at business. Is to say, oh, this is an enemy, this is a competitor, this is a friend. That's like a different scale, operating on a different scale.
Right.
That's operating on a personal scale as opposed to a business scale.
Right.
I mean,
I feel like we attribute sometimes these kind of things because we think, oh, they must be an enemy, right? Like Salesforce, they must hate Microsoft, right?
They're not humans.
Well, actually, I think Salesforce does hate Microsoft.
I think Mark Benioff.
It'd be fair to say Mark Benioff does, but that doesn't speak. He doesn't.
It doesn't mean the company does.
That's right.
Necessarily.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe we're reading a little too much into this. Because
well, no, it's still a big deal because
it is.
It's not Sony is licensing Azure for use in their something department, TVs or something. I mean, they're literally licensing Azure for video games, and that's the reason it's interesting is because both companies compete in that market. Today, Sony is wiping the floor with Microsoft, but I've been saying this for a while, a couple of years now. Microsoft's strength in cloud computing is going to give it a leg up in this coming generation of streaming. How does Sony respond to that? I mean, in a way that I didn't see coming. It was like a little twist ending Game of Thrones thing there. I don't know. I don't think anyone would have predicted this. I don't believe anyone did.
Apple uses Sony camera parts. Samsung uses Sony camera parts. Apple uses Samsung memory in its. This is called business.
It is.
And it's not like humans where, I don't like my neighbor and I'd be damned if I'll borrow his chainsaw.
Sure. Well, if you did, that could get ugly.
Yeah. It's just not, it's a different, it's a different world.
It is. And people are more, companies like at that level, they're more practical.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, we're going to get money out of this? Yeah, let's do it.
In fact, it's always embarrassing when you see something like Steve Jobs saying, I'm going to kill Google. Like, that's more like a monarch talking than a business person talking.
Right.
It's a naive way to think about business. It's not personal. It's never personal.
It makes it more fun to write it that way.
It's a lot more fun to act like it's the Game of Thrones.
Yeah, it does.
It's not.
We don't get a lot of good big tech throwdowns. It's the Godzilla versus King Kong thing. Like, it really doesn't happen that much.
There's no good story. Yeah, that's right. It's no good story. It's a much better story.
Every once in a while.
When Steve Jobs says, I'm going to flatten Google. That's or Mark Benioff says that Microsoft sucks. That's a big story, but it's not the truth. It's not
fun.
Really a true story. It's something we humans like.